It is Wednesday, July the 26th, 2017. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, I have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore I'll pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing in the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's macro online updates. The research document this month updates regional economic developments. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of our monthly report, the global risk, macro, and U.S. economic developments. As I often do, I'd like to tie all of this together into a single discussion on where financialization will lead us. This month I'd like to springboard from last month's Under the Lens video as well as a recent macro analytic video. As such, I'd like to discuss the following subject areas with you. We have recently posted videos about financialization of the U.S. economy. The first was last month's Under the Lens report entitled Are Central Banks Caught in the First Globalization Trap? Though it didn't specifically outline financialization, some of the points I'd like to make in this report are outlined and expanded there. This month's macroanalytics video with Charles Hugh Smith talks about this subject specifically. It was entitled The Road to Financialization. I encourage you to review the 50-minute video, which I touch on here for only a couple of minutes. Charles and I attempted to answer the question that this slide raises. How exactly could this have happened? This parabolic shape doesn't seem to be even remotely sustainable, yet for some reason it has evolved. We then tracked and discussed the major pivots or inflections in its evolution. It is clearly evident that the first signs appeared in March 1968 when the U.S. Congress passed the Gold Reserve Requirements Elimination Act. This stealth piece of legislation eliminated the requirement that 25% of U.S. currency be backed in gold. It was enacted to basically free up approximately $10.4 billion in gold reserves to meet international balance of payment settlement demands. This was the initiation of removing the U.S. from sound money and towards a fiat currency regime. As pressures mounted on the U.S. balance of payments to fund the costs associated with the Vietnam War and President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, President Richard Nixon shocked the world when unexpectedly on August 9, 1971, he completely removed the U.S. dollar from the gold standard, thereby making the U.S. dollar a fiat currency. In other words, the U.S. dollar was no longer backed by anything other than the promise and goodwill of the American taxpayer. The financialization of America had begun. This was really fundamentally driven by the U.S. living beyond its means. That is, the U.S. was consuming more than it produced, and debt was required to maintain the existing U.S. standard of living. As I mentioned earlier, Charles Hugh Smith and I spent nearly 50 minutes on this in the following slide in the Road to Financialization video, explaining each of the ongoing developments. There is no need to repeat that here, but it is important to understand the political spin given for each of these steps, and I refer you to the video directly. What the slides point out is that the financial rules and policy enactments were the result of the requirement and necessity to increase credit and debt in the U.S. Once the U.S. was on this treadmill, the requirement was for geometric growth. The changes required became more suspect and egregious at every pivot. The absurdity of it was blatantly obvious with the overturn of mark-to-market, which, by the way, has never been reversed since and was at the time apparently only temporary, and monetary policies such as ZIRP, that is zero interest rate policy, and the various versions of quantitative easing or QE. What was the takeaway from all this? Charles Hugh Smith summarized it well when he wrote, "Each new policy destroys another level of prudent fiscal financial discipline. The discipline of sound money, gone. The discipline of limited leverage, gone. The discipline of prudent lending, gone. The discipline of mark-to-market discovery of the price of collateral, gone. The discipline of separating investment and commercial banking, i.e. Glass-Steagall, gone. The discipline of open market interest rates, gone. The discipline of losses being absorbed by those who generated the loans, gone." And so on. Every structural source of discipline has basically been eradicated, weakened, or hollowed out. Financialization has consumed the nation's seed corn, and the harvest of instability is ripening in the fields of finance and the real economy alike. So where has the road to financialization taken us, besides to unprecedented historical levels of credit and debt and the obvious loss of financial discipline? What other structural changes have also occurred as a consequence, which may give us better insight into what may be in store for us in the future now that we no longer have any financial discipline? First, we can see that the debt has grown much faster than the economy. We can also see that real U.S. GDP, excluding debt, has plummeted. Some analysis suggests that current U.S. debt levels, from a structurally manageable level, presently need to be reduced by approximately $35 trillion. This is no longer possible in a $25 trillion economy. We have long ago crossed the Rubicon. There is a very close relationship between economic growth, wages, and inflation. They all work together in a self-supporting fashion. What we see is that from the early 80s, when the Federal Reserve Chairman Volcker raised interest rates to well over 15%, we've been experiencing a steady decline in interest rates, which have made credit-fueled consumption less expensive, obviously, while economic growth, as well as wage and salary growth, declined. Credit-fueled consumption has effectively papered over a very troubled structural wage and growth story. We see here, more clearly, the fall in U.S. economic activity as measured by year-over-year GDP growth. Here we see how a surge in credit growth has been used to offset the declines in economic and income growth rates. What we need to appreciate is that debt actually drives rates lower. Debt is a deflationary driver. This is incredibly problematic for central bankers who need inflation to corral excess government debt levels. We'll talk more about that regarding financial repression in a moment. Before we do, we need to also appreciate that increasing debt becomes less effective in increasing economic growth. The amount of debt required to finance $1 of real growth explodes higher. Many, including well-recognized Dr. Lacey Hunt of Hossington Investment Management in Austin, Texas, suggest that increased fiscal stimulus debt is now, in a lot of instances, actually counterproductive to achieving economic growth. To keep this all working, the central bankers were forced to resort to the macroprudential policy of financial repression. This is well documented, and we have a site dedicated to it called the Financial Repression Authority, or FRA. The four pillars of financial repression are shown here. What is most important to our discussion is that negative real rates are required to keep the wheel spinning and increasing credit and debt to be sustainable. This requires inflation, and why, though inflation is good for no one other than primarily the government, we have 2% inflation targeting policies by all the central or most of the central banks. As I mentioned previously, however, debt is deflationary. We can see that central bankers are not winning their goal to get to 2%, their published inflation level, even though we are in year 8 of a recovery from the financial crisis. We have now reached the point where we are no longer truly operating in a capitalist system. My friend Richard Duncan has argued for some time that we are now actually in a system that is more correctly labeled a creditism system. As I mentioned at the beginning, we consume more than we produce. Capitalism doesn't work in such a fashion because capitalism is about savings being invested into productive assets to sustain economic growth. Creditism is about credit and debt being used for consumption to sustain economic growth. The U.S., as a consequence, has grown to nearly an unprecedented 70% consumption economy. As a result, all measures have become grotesquely distorted. So where are we likely headed as a result of all this? I've put together a number of roadmaps that I'd like to discuss briefly. I put this one together during the run-up to the financial crisis as the housing bubble began to implode. You can see the detail in the upper right corner. It has followed the roadmap pretty well ever since. It ends with a failure in fiat currencies as the debt supercycle ends and deleveraging overcomes the market. We are not there yet, but it is within 10 years and likely much sooner. You've also seen this roadmap previously regarding what I see to be the globalization trap that central bankers and many developed economy governments are now caught up in. What it is suggesting is we will eventually see a global liquidity trap. It isn't because the central banks won't inject endless amounts of money into the system. It will be because there is insufficient unencumbered collateral creation to turn it into debt. We're not creating sufficient real wealth or collateral. Real wealth can only be created by growing it, mining it, or building it. You can't print it. This day will occur prior to the fiat currency collapse, in my estimation. It will assist, however, in triggering the fiat currency event. The financial repression policies of quantitative easing and zero interest rate policy were intended to bring demand forward to maintain growth. It is questionable whether this really was achieved, but if they have, then it suggests there is a void in demand behind what was pulled forward. That is, a major slowdown. A bigger issue, in my opinion, is, however, it created unintended massive supply and oversupply buildup because of cheap money for expansion in the emerging and frontier economies. Whether offshore manufacturing or supply chain commodity requirements, there has been nearly $55 trillion in debt created to build out this supply requirement or perceived requirement. This debt needs to be paid for by sustained usage of the supply it was used to create. Who sees a problem here? Another roadmap I put together when I failed to see the causes of the financial crisis actually being addressed is shown here. The financial crisis, in my estimation, would lead to an economic issue, which would culminate in political discord. Maybe, most importantly, it would lead to the collapse of the little discussed $700 trillion over-the-counter, unregulated interest and currency swaps market, a market totally within the purview of the international banks, an edifice of derivatives and contracts waiting for a counterparty failure to cause it to implode, or a sudden gyration, major gyration in interest rates or currency values, a collapsing fiat currency, for example. The economies and roadmaps are together pretty worrisome, but they do not tell us about the future. The roadmap, after leaving sound money and adopting a fiat currency regime, is well marked by failed governments. No one has ever survived it. The Roman Empire left sound money when it started to clip its coins, when it could no longer live beyond its means. It tried to keep the citizenry occupied with a strategy of bread and circuses. Today, I think we call them food stamps and media spectacles like NFL football. Closer to modern times, when the world moved from monarchies to republics and democracies, that was around 1849, we witnessed things like the French Revolution. We had issues of inequality, corruption, and a monarchy out of touch with the realities of the day. Is this sounding familiar? America's aristocracy, once based strictly on bank accounts, acts increasingly hereditary as the vapid offspring and relations of stars in politics, show business, business, and the arts assert their prerogatives into fame, power, and riches. Similarity to the court of the Bourbons is the utter cluelessness of American entitled power elite to the agony of the boiling masses below them. We don't have to look much further than Venezuela to see what to expect when a modern society begins to experience the ravages of removing itself from sound money. Corruption, socialism, then totalitarianism, and utter social collapse in the standard of living, at least as they knew it. I encourage you to read things such as Letters from Venezuela, This is What Life is Really Like in Post-Collapse Society, by Daisy Luther, and other articles, many other articles, by Venezuelans describing the unwinding process of the developed economy. It sounds eerily familiar with what we are currently going through in earlier stages in Venezuela. Don't believe for 1 minute this cannot happen in the U.S., nor the U.S. is not already well on its way down this road, as a result of not being on sound money and the lack of discipline. What should we watch for to see if we are realistically following these previous regimes and therefore could speculate on exactly how it ends? Look for increasing level of political discord. I think we're seeing that. Broader base social unrest. Yes. Increasing level of outbursts of violence. Inability to reach agreement. That is polarization of our political process. Increasing examples of chaos, anarchy, and riots, increasingly more forceful measurements by government, more radical financial, economic, and political policies, a broken social contract. All of these sound eerily familiar at least what I'm seeing up here in the Northeast as I listen to the news every night in America. Make sure you understand, I don't believe the world is coming to an end. But it's like 1849 when we had major changes at hand. That is, we were moving from monarchies to a new form of government, democracy and republics. I think there's a new world order will emerge with new institutions and a new approach to governing. It will be painful, but it is inevitable. It's actually to be expected. It's actually what advancement of a society requires. Some will win, a lot will lose. Pay attention and become part of the winning solution and not part of the problem. So in closing, remember the answer will be to print more money. I keep reminding everybody of this. It is the only answer politicians will ever agree on. Therefore, invest accordingly. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder. Do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed, balanced financial advisor. So until we talk again, May 2017, turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And thank you very much for listening.